ну, чики-брики в дамке. Попали, попали, суки! Твою мою! А ну, чики-брики в дамке. Попали, попали, суки! Ай! Братан, наваляй йому, я в обход!
Берем його тепленького! Прикрий мене! Братан, не дай йому висунутися!
Ай, бля! А ну, чики-брики в дамке. Бля. Попали, попали, суки! А ну, чики-брики в дамке. Уши! Ай, пацан! А ну, чики-брики в дамке. Ай, твою... Пацан!
Hello. First of all, can I be heard? Can people hear me? Is my mic working? Did the music for the little video work okay, or was it muted? So the obligatory audio check. If everyone can hear. You're in bad shape. Sounds good. No sound. Yep. Yes. Hello. Hey, how's everyone doing? Yep, so the music played okay. The audio's working. You can hear me. It's decent quality enough. So I've mastered a part of OBS. You're a big man, but you're in bad shape. Oh, I keep reading that as its own sentence. Can't hear. Yes. Okay. Good. Yay. Hi, everybody. Happy New Year. I know I sort of briefly did a stream after New Year, but for those who missed it, Happy New Year, guys. How are you all doing? Is everyone doing well? Everyone happy? Everyone embracing another year that's going to probably suck? Hail Gonzalo. Yes, Gonzalo is going to join us later on. He's going to use every straw man in the book. The music and the audio was fine, great, yes. So I've improved one part of OBS. If there's anything to be getting out of this stream, it's that. So this stream, as the title says, is going to be a rundown of events in Soledar. I kind of was putting off this stream until we sort of had a kind of clarification on what was happening in Soledar. And it seems to have happened last night into today. So that's what we will be discussing and reviewing. The ramifications, how it's happened, who was involved, and where we could go from here. So let's see if this will work appropriately. Yes, that's showing up on my screen. But And I make that a little bit more. No. It's not quite working. Forgive me, I'm just should probably have done this before I display capture. Do I want to display capture or do I want to try window? I'll try window capture and see how that goes. Try getting all fancy pants. So that, I think it's basically the same thing. Or is it? No, it seems to have actually gotten. I'm not too sure. Okay. I think it's decent enough for what we're doing. But so, as for people who have been in the Telegram, have been aware, and if you've been paying attention to some of the news, there's been a bit of a big development after months, at least on the Russian side, of not very good news or stagnant news. The town of Soledar, the pronunciation, of course, I'm not a native speaker of Russian Ukrainian, so forgive me, but I pronounce it as it's spelt, Soledar, is reported to have fallen to the Russian forces, mostly composed of Wagner. This particular map is still showing that the town is not yet fully fallen to the Russians. I think this particular map I usually use is a bit outdated, and it also has a bit more of a pro-Ukrainian bias. But for people who are sort of wondering of the geography, here is the outline of Ukraine. Kiev up there, Kherson down there, Bakhmut, which I'm sure most of you, if you're watching this stream, will be aware of to some degree, is here. The town in question is north of Bakhmut. It is about, I think it's around about 5 kilometers to the northeast of Bakhmut. This town here, Soledar. Soledar traditionally has been well regarded for its massive salt mines, which played a part in the battle, potentially still is, but not as much as was expected. It's a small industrial town, Soviet-era industrial town, because of the salt mines. There's a large salt works, but it has also been part of the Bakhmut front line since the Russian advance effectively stagnated and stalled. When would it have been? Last June, July? It's kind of been on the front line. Slowly, the Russians have inched their way forward since, and over the past week, the Russians have managed to actually achieve a bit of a breakthrough and a rare, at least relatively, victory on this front over the past week. Also, which I think might be more pressing for the situation in Bakhmut, is another village fell to the Russians, which hasn't picked up as much attention. This town here, I've seen it labeled as Konstavna. Here, I believe this is the Ukrainian name, Kalishivka. Again, forgive my horrific pronunciation. I'm not a Slav. So this village of Kalishivka, this hasn't picked up on it, but Russian sources have very much been talking about it yesterday. This town fell to the Russians as well. As you can see, this is just on the southern outskirts of Bakhmut. I'll go into why I think this might be a bit more pressing than Soledar in a bit, but we'll focus on Soledar and try and tick it off the itinerary. So, around about a week ago, there is a pickup of news that the significant fighting and Wagner, professional Wagner. Before I go into that, I should probably caveat that. For people who are not aware, the Wagner Group is a nominally private mercenary military contractor group that's very closely aligned to the Russian state. It acts as an arm of Russian foreign policy, particularly in Africa and places like Syria. It's led by a guy called Yevgeny Prigozhin. I need to put marbles in my mouth because I've just lost my ability to pronounce. Yevgeny Prigozhin. He is the guy who runs it. there's been a bit of they've been a very major part of the Russian military operation in Ukraine for the past few months, to such a degree, at least on the Bakhmut front, they have seemingly relegated the Russian standing military to a support role. So everyone's heard about Bakhmut and all the significant Russian Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut. The people who have been attacking Bakhmut has been Wagner. They're the ones who have been leading the charge. They're the ones who have been slamming their head against the Ukrainian defenses in Bakhmut, but with a caveat. The Wagner troops largely engaged in Bakhmut, launching these almost suicidal attacks, are the very poor quality but Wagner troops. They are the conscripts. These are the people who are recruited from the prisons. These are very disposable, very low value troops that the Wagner at least have been throwing in to keep up the pressure on Bakhmut, and it showed in the casualties that they have taken. That is not the full spectrum of the Wagner group. There is a very professional, very well trained, very well equipped, very high value section of the Wagner outfit, the professional Wagner part of Wagner. These are the ones who we'll be talking about a lot, because as we shift north to talk specifically around Soledar, the offensive into Soledar was largely made up by this very professional core of Wagner. There is some speculation that some elements of the Russian VDV has been involved as well in the push into Soledar, but largely the show has been Wagner once again. These were the guys who seem to have broken in across the Ukrainian front line and then pushed into the town itself and physically took the town from the Ukrainians. So how has this come about? For months now, without giving an entire tangent, this front line all along Bakhmut, the Bakhmut front line has been fairly stagnant and static. In Bakhmut itself, advances are relegated to meters a week. Largely, fighting happens in the south here around a garbage dump, up here around a petrol station, and it's effectively been Wagner will take the petrol station, for example, one day. Ukrainian counterattack will take it the next day. Now, a week after that, it will fall to Wagner. The Ukrainians will retake it. That's kind of the fighting that's been happening around Bakhmut, but also along the wider part of the front, there has been similar. A lot of these battles and attacks have been company level, sometimes on a platoon level. They're very small. You're talking about their smallest dozens of troops might be put into an attack, going up to maybe a couple hundred if there are some larger ones. These are largely probing attacks from what I estimate them to be. And that is what the Wagner, to a degree, parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk militias, and also parts of the Russian army have been engaged in on this front. I'm talking about the wider front from, say, where it's hard to classify, but say from this part of Donetsk all the way on up until, say, Belhorovka. This is what I would classify roughly as the Bakhmut front. The Russians have been launching various probing attacks. These are small level attacks, and as the name implies, they are to probe the Ukrainian front line. They're to look for weaknesses, see where the line is strongest, see where the line is a bit weaker defended, and if they find where there is a bit of a weakness that they can exploit, that is where what we have seen in Soledar, from what I can estimate, is that the Wagner group especially has determined in this example that Bakhmut is not going to fall. We've been throwing hundreds of men, tying down Ukrainian troops into the fight there. We're going to keep throwing men into the battle in Bakhmut to tie down those Ukrainian troops. So there's more Ukrainian troops committed to defending Bakhmut as opposed to potentially defending other places in the front. We've sent out some probing attacks, found that the Ukrainian defenses around Soledar are a bit lacking. Maybe this is where we'll start to commit our professional troops, our well-trained troops, our well-equipped troops, see if we can achieve a breakthrough. The Ukrainian front line did start to fall back. The Wagner group, with Russian army artillery support, potentially elements of the VDV, were then pushed into this front, and they've effectively pushed the Ukrainians back all the way. And Wagner has committed to the fight ever since, and has been exploiting this weakness in the Ukrainian front line. It also seems that as part of this deteriorating situation of this part of the front, that Ukrainians have started to pull out some defenders from elsewhere, potentially from Bakhmut itself. But I think also this is what's happened down here in Klishivka, is that some Ukrainian troops were pulled out to reinforce other parts of the front. Some Russian, maybe another Wagner probing attack tested this part of the front, determined that the Ukrainian defenses were starting to be faulty there. Then, in a pretty stunning surprise attack, from what I could gather, is the Russians were able to rush the town, completely taking it, now hold these heights, which is going to be crucial, which I'll go into a bit later, and now has put a bit more pressure onto Bakhmut in the south. But going to Soledar itself, so just to give you a quick rundown of the situation, from my understanding, is that the Russians have effectively taken the bulk of the town. They are particularly positioned on this green area, which is a part of high ground. From this high ground, they have oversight onto these roads out of Bakhmut. The front line, from my understanding, is somewhere around this here area. This shaded area is the salt works and the salt mines. There's various entrances to the salt mines, but the point is that the town seems to have completely fallen to the Russians at this stage. Ukrainian forces were pulling out heavy equipment over the past few days. It seems that Ukrainian infantry were largely pushed out yesterday. However, there was a contingent of Ukrainian soldiers that is still holding out in the center of the town and potentially in parts of the salt works. There's estimates around about 200 to 400 Ukrainian troops might be encircled in Bakhmut. Forgive me. So, for all intents and purposes, unless the Ukrainians are going to launch a counterattack in the coming days, Bakhmut, Soledar, forgive me, is now effectively part of the Donetsk People's Republic, as Denis Pushilin, the head of the DNR, stated yesterday. So, just to go into some oddities around it, there's still some dispute if there's Ukrainian troops in the salt mines itself. The salt mines are quite large. I am aware that there was pictures put out by Prigozhin, one with a tank. That appears to have been in a cave system further to the east in this sort of area, not in the salt mines itself. However, there was then photos of Prigozhin in the salt mines confirmed by the walls. The salt mines have a very distinct wall to them inside. However, there appears to be numerous entrances into the salt mines, so it's not confirmed, especially if Ukrainian troops are still holding out in the center of town and potentially part of the salt works. If the Russians, the Wagner group, have control entirety of the salt mines, or just part of it, that's still open to a bit of dispute as at this stage. However, where should I progress from this now? So from my understanding, from what I can see, Soledar is now, as I said, part of the DNR. It's just waiting to see if the Ukrainians are able to muster a counterattack to try and push the Wagner group back out of the town. However, I'm skeptical because generally on this front, the Ukrainians very rarely conduct a counterattack on such a scale. But we'll have to wait and see. So why is this so important? In and of itself, I would say that Soledar, while good news for the Russians, especially in terms of narrative, for the Russians have not really taken any ground in months. To finally take a town on this part of the front is, narratively, it's very good news for the Russians. But let's say in of itself, strategically, it's mediocre. It's not decisive. It doesn't entail the entire collapse of the front. It is good, but it's not decisive. However, with the fall of Kalishka in the south, I think Soledar now has a bit more weight to its fall. So just to give you, this is a fairly small part of the front in of itself, these two areas. However, the big angle around it is this focal point of Bakhmut, and what happens, how this. So I'll focus on Soledar just to begin with. So now that Soledar is effectively fallen, if the Russians are able to consolidate the position, carry out clearing operations, this opens up a number of options for the Russians. However, I would be very surprised if the Ukrainians haven't erected significant defense in depth all across this area. So the Russians, in my mind, will have just fought their way into a fortress. Now they'll have to fight their way into another one. But nonetheless, it does open up potential options for the Russians. To the north, it potentially complicates the Ukrainian defense of Siversk. We're still a fair bit out from the Russians potentially taking Siversk, but namely this road, and I think there's a railway as well, but I don't think the railway will be operational. But this road to the north, yet Siversk will still have supplies coming in from the north and the east, but it removes this transport artery because, again, remember this hill here, this isn't forested terrain. There is a bit of trees, but it's not forest. This is like steppe land, industrial steppe land. Russians up here have overwatch on this area, so these roads, I'd be surprised if you could drive up that road and not come under fire, be it from small arms fire or something heavier from the Russians. So this road is effectively out of play for the Ukrainians. Also, it now means that the Ukrainian defense on the further to the north, for example, in this Rojdolivka, for example, well, instead of the defenders of this town, of this village, having to just focus towards this front, they now have to start to redeploy their assets and their defensive capabilities to the south in case the Russians, for example, decide to make a push north and undermine the Ukrainian defense is to the further north. Because I've been very critical of the Russian strategy on this entire front. I think this was foolish from the start, the slamming of the head against the strongest Ukrainian defenses on the entire theater of the war. But nonetheless, what the Russians have done. However, going back to a previous battle in Popasna, this town was a veritable fortress. The Russians spent a month smashing their head against it. However, they eventually broke through. And the Russians, whenever they achieved this breakthrough for this very heavily defended area, they were able to exploit it, push forces through, which necessitated the effective collapse of the entire Ukrainian defense of Lysychansk, if people can remember that far back. So there is the potential, if the Russians are able to enact a bit more maneuver warfare, if they're able to push through enough troops, forgive me, exploit this breakthrough in this the Ukrainian defensive lines. However, again, I would be very surprised if the Ukrainians don't have further defenses further back, but nonetheless, the Russians are able to exploit this. They could undermine the Ukrainian defense further north, and now we'll look further south. The fall of Soledar in and of itself does not necessitate the inevitable collapse of the Ukrainian defense of Bakhmut. Soledar is a bit further out than this town, Kalishivka, to the south. But nonetheless, it does complicate things for the defense of Bakhmut. I think these roads would be a bit too far out to come under fire control from this hill here. But this is high ground. This is high ground here. This area here is a bit of a valley. So this is a river valley. So this road I think is a bit too far out. There's a lot of there's a few trees, there's some urban area. I think this road is out of view for potential Russian fire from this hill. But saying that, this river valley I think is going to be a very complicated area for the Ukrainians to defend from here on out, with the loss of this hill, with the loss of Soledar, if it's not direct fire from the hill, from Ukrainian observation on the hill, that was going to report back to Ukrainian from Russian observation on the hill. reporting back targets potentially in this valley to Russian artillery to bear on this river valley, which I think, like I say, I think this might become a bit of a very significant issue for the Ukrainians. And if it does, as you can see, this will be the northern flank of Bakhmut. Very complicated, to put the least. So Soledar falling itself does not necessarily mean Bakhmut is going to fall. However, and I don't think this is going to mean Bakhmut is destined to fall, but with the fall of Kalishka, I can't pronounce these names, I'm very bad at this, but with the fall of this town, this wooded area here is a small hill in of itself. So there are now Russians in this wooded area, from my understanding, from what has been reported. Just up here is one of the major arterial routes into Bakhmut, and having a look, this is largely fields. This is farm fields. There's a small residential area of Dak is here. Yes. Why can I pronounce stuff today? Of Dachas here. But if there are Russian troops up on this hill, I think they would have fire control. Fire control, I should probably have explained, that is, you don't physically control a space, but you're able to fire onto it and prevent the enemy from using or moving through that area. So that's what fire control is. So I think the Russians will have fire control over this road, and this is one of the major arterial routes into Bakhmut. That in of itself would not be catastrophic or bad for the Ukrainians. It's not good, because there is also smaller roads here, and there's also the northern road. However, this road, and if the Russians are able to push down from the north from their success in Soledar and put this road under fire control, I think that's whenever the Ukrainian defense of Bakhmut starts to become compromised and complicated very, very greatly. That means all Ukrainian reinforcements and supply have to go through this road, which these roads are round about the same size. But it is not a big road. It's barely a 2-lane road from what I was able to gather from looking at it on Google Earth. You could imagine you're trying to put tanks, trying to bring in supplies for thousands of troops. People remember back to my very early streams during the opening stages of the war, where I spent hours going on Google Street View, going through random roads in Zaporozhye or northern Kiev Oblast, being very autistic and examining the roads and infrastructure. That's where this kind of comes into play. You've got barely a 2-lane road that's been hit by artillery fairly significantly, so parts of it are degraded and are effectively mud. Temperatures dropped a bit, but it's not minus 15. The ground hasn't fully frozen out. The weather, from my understanding, is a bit dynamic. It is projected to go down, but the point I'm trying to make is it's very muddy. If you've got a degraded road that's been hit by artillery that's damaged, it's going to be a quagmire. You've got this small quagmire road which crosses a river, which I can imagine is probably leaking very badly out into the road. Pardon me. You're trying to bring in reinforcements, potentially tanks, BPMs, BTRs, supplies for thousands of troops, all crushed down this small road. I guess you could try and ford them across the fields, but the fields are just going to turn to complete mud and this stuff will flounder. The point I'm trying to make is the Russians are able to cut off this road and really complicate it, and the Ukrainians are just depending on this road. That's whenever I think we can start to talk about the Russians seriously making a bit of progress in Bakhmut. Because up till this stage, the Russians haven't in Bakhmut itself. Like I say, they've been banging ahead against a concrete slab. However, to the south and to the north, these developments, if the Russians are able to properly exploit them and follow them up, then I think we can start to talk about where the actual Battle of Bakhmut will begin, where the Ukrainians might start thinking about, can they sustainably hold the town, and where the Russians might start thinking, okay, this is where we might actually be able to enter Bakhmut itself and fight for the city. So that's the significance of the fall of Soledar, but also the fall of Klishivka to the south. One in of itself not really bad, not good, but in of itself not catastrophic. Both of them at the same time. This is where I think Ukrainian defenders in Bakhmut and Ukrainian general staff and commanders commanding this part of the front might start to get a bit concerned, to put it mildly, about the sustainability of their operations in the defense of the city. So that's the situation in the Bakhmut sector. So now what's the next part I'll go into? I'll do a quick roundup. To be fair, there hasn't really been much that's gone on elsewhere in the front. The only real other thing that's of significant note is fighting has picked up again on the Crimea to Liman sector. The Russians took some ground back over the past couple days. I think they regained around about a mile of territory. They were able to push the Ukrainians back. But there is also rumors that there is significant numbers of Ukrainian troops starting to mass in this area, potentially for the coming spring offensive that we've all been waiting for. So on that note, I'll quickly delve into that. We haven't had the offensives we've been expecting yet. The winter offensives haven't happened. I think that's largely because I think that is largely down to the weather and the unseasonably warm and wet weather that's happened in Ukraine. To this stage, the ground hasn't thawed out. Heavy vehicles and weaponry can't really maneuver in the mud. So I think that's kind of probably why we haven't seen a significant offensive yet. However, there is this big cold batch that I previously mentioned is coming in, so maybe that will be the window then. But saying that, there is a bit of a mystery. Maybe the situation in Soledar might provide a bit of clarity to it. People can remember back to the autumn, whenever you had tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops committed to the campaign in Kherson, where it's pretty bloody on both sides. But ultimately, the Russians pulled out. There is a Ukrainian army group, and there is also a Russian army group that seems to have largely disappeared after that. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers who were previously committed in this front and all their equipment. There's been various reports of them redeploying to Zaporozhye, but from there, they have not been seen since, largely to any large degree. The speculation, of course, is that they are being prepped for a coming offensive of their own. Time will tell with that, but they have not been committed to the fight. So the point I'm trying to make here is there's a lot of people, as always, in my Telegram who are convinced that Ukraine is about to run out of men, that the Ukrainian army is about to collapse because so many of them being killed. No, not by any long stretch of the imagination, because first of all, you have tens of thousands of battle-hardened Ukrainians who were previously committed on the Kherson front, who have disappeared. We don't know where they are, but you can bet if something pretty big happens and they're needed, they will emerge. On the flip side, you also have, remember, a lot of the Russian defenders here during the Kherson campaign were some of the most elite Russian units. You had guards battalions, you had parts of the VDV. So to begin with, they were pretty well trained and pretty well equipped. They're also battle-hardened because they've gone through the Kherson fight. They themselves have largely disappeared. So both sides have at least an army group that have kind of dematerialized and no one quite knows where they are. At the same time, the Russian Mobiks, the mobilized, a lot of them are unaccounted for. What they're doing and where they are, we're not too sure. The Ukrainians also have a lot of mobilized troops. The Ukrainians are pumping out, I think it was estimated like a battalion every half a month. So the point I'm trying to make is, but one side or the other is not going to collapse because they're running out of men. Both of them have a lot of manpower still to draw on. But that's a point just to raise. That we are expecting fairly large offensives still to come in the nearish future. Where and when, we'll have to wait and see. I kind of maybe it's a bias because it's what I would do, but I'm kind of thinking that the Russians might try and make a push in Zaporozhye. I need to do my own specific stream on why I personally would do that and why I think the Russians should do that. But in of itself, that's kind of where I'm thinking the Russians might be doing theirs. And the scuttlebutt and where I'm personally thinking the Ukrainians might do their own offensive if they are, is on what remains of the Kharkiv front into Luhansk, so up in the Crimea to Zavatoy area. So these are the kind of things to keep an eye out for, and just my personal speculation on where we might want to keep eyes on, because again, what's happening here is largely Wagner. These are Wagner men who are doing the fighting in the Bakhmut area. The artillery is largely the Russian army, but the people storming the front, manning the front, are the DNR militias and the Wagner men. So the point I'm trying to make there is here, where the front and the war is at its most intense, the Russian army is largely absent to its own war. It's largely playing a supporting role in its own conflict. So the Russian military itself seems to be saving its strength and its potential combat capacity for things to come later. Because at this point, this is Wagner's show. So with that, I'll then go into the next thing I was looking to cover, which is a bit more politics than it is militarily, but I know people sort of have a tendency to view Russia and the Russians and the people fighting for the Russians as a hegemonic bloc, and the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian national battalions, the Azov battalions, but nonetheless, Ukraine is Ukraine. It's a hegemonic bloc. That's that side. Russian, Wagner, Chechens, yada yada yada. They're all that side. It's a hegemonic bloc. There's a bit more nuance to that. There are disparities within these countries. There are power blocks at play. There is conflicting interests at play. And they do exist to a degree on the Ukrainian side, but I think they're a bit more pronounced on the Russian side, which I will go into now. For people who've been in my Telegram channel for a while, if people can remember back to after the collapse of the Kharkiv front, where Kadyrov and Prigozhin started becoming very, very vocal against the Russian military, specifically Colonel General Lapin and Shogu. That is because there is a bit of a power struggle between those two men. They have different interests, is what I'm trying to say, is that there's just because they're fighting the same war does not mean they're all aligned in the same political persuasion. They're all jockeying for position. They're all trying to get one up on another potentially in some cases, because Shogu, not so much Gerasimov and Lapin because they're career army men, but Shogu, Kadyrov, Prigozhin, these are political figures. They have political bases. Shogu was, I wouldn't really say he's an oligarch, but he's part of the Ziloviki. He's part of Putin's inner circle. Kadyrov obviously runs the Chechen Republic. Prigozhin is not really part of Putin's inner circle in the Siloviki sense, but he is part of the club, as it were. He's close to Putin, but he's not in the inner circle. Kadyrov and Prigozhin sort of made this alliance to start attacking the regular Russian army back after the collapse of the Kharkiv front. This, I think, is part of a power struggle that's kind of going on in Moscow, because this is conjecture on my part, so take it for what it's worth. It's just my kind of idea on the politics at play. I think the war is kind of, death knell is probably too strong a word and it's got connotations, but I think the war and the way Putin's conducted it and how it's been a shambles and a debacle from the start, I think that's kind of put a time limit on the tenure of Vladimir Putin as president of Russia. So I think that people who can are starting to jockey the position for that eventual scenario where Putin steps aside and there is then a succession of some sort. The conjecture before the war was that Shoigu was, I should probably have mentioned that for people who are not aware, Sergei Shoigu, it is Sergei, isn't it? I should probably know his first name before. Sergei, yeah, it is Sergei. Sergei Shoigu is the Russian Minister of Defense. He was largely alleged to have been the designated successor, as it were, to Vladimir Putin whenever Putin is expected to stand down, when or however that was meant to be. The war starts. It goes not very good, and hasn't been going very good ever since. So Shoigu has lost a lot of his political capital in Moscow, and I think that what Prigozhin, with maybe an alliance a bit with Kadyrov, is trying to do is trying to jockey position to say the Russian military hasn't been able to do what it is projected to do under this particular guy. Look at me, I'm not the Russian military. I run a private military contractor, and I am pulling out results where the Russian military under Sergei Shoigu and the old guard of the Russian general staff can't. So just to give you an idea, the Russians take all this ground in the first month of the war, and ever since then it has been a steady erosion of what the Russians have. There's been very little since around about June, whenever Lysychansk fell. The Russian advance effectively just kind of stagnated, and ever since then it's just been a steady erosion of the Russian holdings in Ukraine. The Russian army has not, most of the Russian army is not really, in fact, not just the Russian army, the Russian Air Force, in fact, the Russian military in aggregate is largely performed very under par to what it was meant to do. Along comes the Wagner group. Prigozhin says, okay, we're short of men. I'll find you men to put into the front. And also now, for the first time in months, the Russians have a victory, a fairly decent victory that they can put out and say, this is what we have. And it wasn't the Russian army that seems to have largely done it. It was the Wagner group under Prigozhin. So domestically back in Russia, this is why I think Prigozhin went to the front as soon as Soledar was taken, well, in the process of being taken, and took those photos in the salt mines. He's jockeying for position. He's trying to put out a image domestically in Russia to say the army's failed, Wagner has succeeded. And not only has Wagner succeeded, this is where I also think there's a bit more nuance to it. Putin has rarely left Moscow. He has left Moscow to go to like Ural Zavod's factories and here and there, but largely he's not left Moscow since the war has started, let alone gone to the front and seen the troops at the front. Along comes Prigozhin. Not only does he go to the front, he goes to an active battlefield and takes photos with his men as they're in the process of securing a victory. So I'm not saying this is a calculated dig at Putin. I'm not going to say that Prigozhin is formulating a coup. What I am saying is that Prigozhin clearly is if not, he was always looking in a political lens to say, okay, I'm not saying he's looking to become president of Russia, but it's hard to see him carrying this out and carrying out these sort of actions, going around to take photos in such a way to run his own media organization via the Grey Zone, various Telegram channels, and also actual media organizations in Russia itself. Prigozhin's trying to build up his political base to what I would imagine is, I think he's looking to become part of the inner circle. What that position could be, time will tell. But nonetheless, at least to me, I would imagine to Russians domestically, to people within politics in Moscow, you have the failing Russian military under Shoigu, full of corruption. You then got Prigozhin, who comes along, goes to the front and seemingly secures victories where the Russian military can't. So it stands Prigozhin in a very good light. And also, if you are looking to build up a political base in Russia, it's also pretty handy, I can imagine, to have an entire private army, very well equipped, battle hardened private army that's extremely loyal to you because you've gone to the front and seen them in action. You've recruited for them, you've seen to their needs. So that's just kind of my little conjecture and spiel on Prigozhin itself. But to go back to link this to what I was saying before, this is kind of where I think whenever you hear about power struggles and stuff in Russia, that's the way you have to look at it, is these various figures who are jockeying for position here and there. Had the Russian army performed to expectations in the opening of the war, and let's say the 4 days to Kiev worked and Ukraine was ultimately taken in around about 2 to 3 weeks, is what seems to have been the original plan. Again, that's speculation, but I think it's speculation backed up by the evidence of how the Russians conducted the invasion. But saying that, had the Russian army performed to expectation, rolled over Ukraine, secured a victory within the space of a month, then I don't think there would be any real jockeying for position or power struggles at all in Moscow, because one, Shoge Shoyu would have proved himself as a decisive leader, someone who can get things done. Obviously, history didn't happen that way. And now Shogu has appeared weak for a while, and there are people out there who are looking to exploit it. As politics is politics. We can all think about the war and what happens at the front, but at the end of the day, there's politics behind this. Moscow is fairly far off from the fighting, so people will jockey for position. Where does Kadyrov come into this? Why was Kadyrov so heavy into putting out all these videos of all these well-equipped Chechens that all these videos of the lines of hundreds of well-armed jeeps and Bohankas and all these well-equipped Chechen Kadyrovite fighters heading to Ukraine that seems to have gotten lost between Chechnya and Ukraine itself? It's because Kadyrov was himself jockeying for position in Russia. Yeah, he might be the head of the Chechen Republic. He might be king, effectively, of the Chechen Republic. But at the end of the day, he ultimately does depend on the graces of Moscow in terms of money, and also for well, it's a bit of a nip and tuck with Chechnya, and it deserves its own stream, and I don't know enough of the Chechen dynamic to really discuss it in depth. But needless to say, Kadyrov survives where he is because, well, he survives in terms of Moscow's good graces because he keeps a lid on Chechnya. Whereas if he was, let's say if he was to fall out with Moscow, is the card he could pull out and say, well, I'm going to start causing Chechen terrorism and causing trouble for Moscow. Whereas the way Russia has conducted its relations with Chechnya since, like, Kadyrov came to power in, what was it, 2006, his father was blown up. As far as Moscow's concerned, as long as there isn't terrorism coming out of Chechnya, we'll throw billions of rubles at it and we'll let Kadyrov sort it out and do what he wants. But Kadyrov is always looking for more money. He's always looking for more influence in Moscow for various reasons, but I don't want to get sidetracked into a full Chechen politics stream. So if Kadyrov can then align himself with up-and-coming powers, up-and-coming personalities and factions in Russia as a result of the war, that would stand him in a better position. Whereas whenever Colonel General Lapin and Gerasimov and Shogu were being put through the ringer after the collapse of the Kharkov front, well, that was the point where the Russian army domestically started to lose a lot of its political capital. And whenever I say prestige, I mean prestige within Moscow, not domestically to the Russian people, but within the corridors of power in the Kremlin. So that's kind of where this power dynamic and you have to sort of understand this whenever it comes up in discussion in Russia. Similar stuff, I'm sure, happens in Ukraine, but not to the same extent, because Ukraine is, most Ukrainians view this as an existential fight, an existential battle. So a lot of factional politics in Ukraine. Well, for a start, the Ukrainian government has effectively banned most of it, but also for the ones that isn't banned, they've kind of put it aside to fight the existential fight against the Russians. However, before the invasion, this is where you get things like the Azov battalion, the Eder battalion, and it's chafing with the central government in Kiev in that dynamic there. So there is the same dynamic in Ukraine, but it's nowhere near the same extent as it is in Russia, because, as I say, although the Russian state might say it is an existential fight, and I think it is to a degree an existential fight for Russia, this war, most Russians aren't really feeling that. You know, Moscow's hundreds of miles away from a war zone. Most Ukrainians have woken up to the sound of artillery or to missile strikes or airstrikes in their city as a part of this war. There's strikes across Ukraine. That galvanizes a people into a commonality, a common struggle. While there has been strikes in Russia, the vast majority of Russians haven't woken up to the sound of artillery hitting their town, to airstrikes and missile strikes hitting them. The war is something still very far away for most Russians. So they aren't viewing this as existential, say, as most Ukrainians are. So that sort of implicit agreement that most Ukrainians have, where the main struggle is against Russia, petty politics takes a backside to that. To a lot of Russians and to politics out of Moscow, that sort of mentality hasn't set in. So that's my little spiel on pardon me, on factionalism and the like in power struggles in Russia at the moment. So now, what is the next bit? Pardon me. Next bit to cover. I should really write down my thoughts because I keep forgetting the ones that I want to cover. But it was in my mind, but it's completely dropped off at the moment. I guess what I'll go into is the other thing to look out this year is the scaling up of NATO support. For people who haven't been keeping autistic attention to this like I do, NATO and this American support to Ukraine is escalating. It's increasing, not decreasing, contrary to what a lot of people in my Telegram group seems to have assumed. The United States has pretty well. The French opened the gates. Forgive me. Every time I talk for a while, I start to get a cough. So the French opened the gates to this. The French announced that they were going to start sending wheeled armored fighting vehicles. They've got a big gun on them. They're not APCs. People label them as tanks, but they're not tanks because technically a tank has to have tracks. But the French announced they're sending armored vehicles to Ukraine that has a big gun on it, which, outside of T-72s and old Soviet stuff, largely NATO hasn't sent to Ukraine in decent numbers. This was followed up by the United States saying they were going to start sending Bradleys to Ukraine. The Bradley is, it depends on the model which they're going to send, but it's either an infantry fighting vehicle or it's an APC. Essentially, the Bradley is, I should probably just bring up a picture of it. The Bradley is, it's kind of like a tank. It's like a mini tank is the way to view it, but most models of this carry troops inside it. Why is this so big? A lot of people, for some reason, are saying these are useless, and all NATO equipment to Ukraine is completely useless, as if Russian equipment to Ukraine is suddenly somehow superior. This is a fairly decent bit of kit. It depends how it's used. As the Russian equipment, most Russian equipment's actually pretty good. It's just been used pretty badly. Depending on the model of Bradley that's sent to Ukraine, the Americans have announced they're going to send 50 of them. This is a pretty decent upgrade. It's a lot larger than a BMP, so it's a bigger target. But depending the model and how it's used, it could be a very decent addition to the Ukrainian inventory. And if at the moment it's just 50 that's been earmarked to go, but I think that's probably going to increase in number as the months go on, because the Americans have 2,000 of these in storage. So, I'm not even going to respond to that. So, that was what the Americans and the French have sent. That was escalated a couple days ago, where the British announced that they were starting to consider sending. Okay, no, I'm going to respond to this because it's just, this is a cope, and I know I shouldn't be responding to cope posts from chat, but this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I can link multiple videos of JATO equipment stuck in the mud. I can send you the same amount of videos for Russian equipment stuck in the mud. Like it's just a stupid point. What's the point you're trying to make? And also the Bradley up to 42 years old now. Yeah, how old are the T-72s and the BMPs and the BTRs that the Russians are using? See, this is where you all think I'm a Ukrainian shill, because I've like slapped down these really stupid points that a lot of you people adhere to. It's just like, why, where, like, just why? But sorry, I need to. Just those two comments, just idiotic. So the British were then announced that they were seriously considering sending Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine, which is a big escalation if it does happen. The Challenger 2, by some accounts, is one of the best tanks in the world. Well, actually, it is one of the best tanks in the world, but some people consider it the best. It depends on how you rate it. The Challenger 2 is a very sophisticated bit of kit. The estimates were roundabout. The British were considering sending 10 of them. There is a caveat to this, though. However, if those were to be sent to Ukraine, I think that they're small in number, but they're very sophisticated, and I think they can do a lot with them despite the small numbers. The same is with HIMARS. They're small in numbers, but they've been used to great effect. So, then I will come. That has then been escalated by the Poles, as the Poles have now said that they are going to start potentially sending Leopard 2s to Ukraine, which again is widely regarded as one of the best tanks in the world. It depends on the model of the Leopard 2 that the Poles are potentially sending, but this is being followed up where the Poles and the French are now pressuring the Germans for the Germans to start sending their Leopard 2s to Ukraine. So the point of what I'm trying to say is, up till now, the Ukrainian army has been subsisting off of old, outdated, largely inferior to the Russian Soviet era kit. These are the T-64s, the old Ukrainian BMPs, the BTR-4, pretty good kit. Depends what it goes up against, but fairly sophisticated. NATO equipment up to this stage has been outdated stuff. You're talking the M113s, some French VABs, stuff like this. It's not cutting edge, it's surplus. What is happening now, the Bradleys that will go, likely the Leopards that will go, the Challengers are the ones that are probably going to be in storage, because the Challenger's going to be going out of service largely. Well, the Challenger 2 at least is going to go out of service in the next 10 years. It's not ultra modern kit, but it is a substantial upgrade from what the Ukrainians have been using so far. The numbers are small, but NATO support to Ukraine is upgrading as time goes on. Russian support is, well, the Russians are pumping out T-90Ms, which is good for the Russians, but how sustainable it is, we'll have to see. But the T-90M is probably the best tank that is on the battlefield at the moment. However, the T-90M will wipe the floor with every Ukrainian tank at the moment. unless it's somehow surprised and there's a T-64 somehow ends up behind it. The T-90M will easily wipe the floor with all the Czech and Polish T-72Ms that have gone to Ukraine. It will wipe the floor with the T-64. The Ukrainians don't really have an answer in terms of a tank to the T-90M and to certain models of the T-72 that the Russians are fielding. That's why the Ukrainians have largely been relying on anti-tank guided missiles. However, if Leopard 2s and Challengers start to turn up in Ukraine in significant numbers, if you get Bradley starting to turn up equipped with TOW missile launchers, that's whenever I think that sort of Russian... The Russians have a domineering advantage in terms of tanks and heavy vehicles. However, if this stuff starts to turn up in Ukraine in significant numbers, that's whenever that sort of advantage starts to degrade. So, the example here I would give is that the Russians had a just completely dominating superiority in artillery. Along comes HIMARS, degrades that superiority. The Russians have a superiority in artillery, but it is not to the scale as it was before HIMARS came along. In small numbers, but were used in a decent way that greatly degraded the capability of the Russian artillery forces to negate Ukrainian operations. That similar dynamic could come about with these Western tanks going to Ukraine. But this is where the big caveat comes in. It's going to be what I would imagine a very long time before Leopard 2s, potentially Challengers, and other Western tanks of such, well, they're fourth generation tanks. No, they're not fourth. These modern Western tanks turn up on battlefields firing at Russian troops. I don't know off the top of my head the average training time for a Challenger 2 crew, but I can imagine it's probably a couple years. The Leopard 2 training course is 2.5 years. We're talking potentially years out before I would imagine the Ukrainians can take these tanks and start firing them at Russian troops. So unless the war is going to go on that long, I think the Challengers and the Leopards are probably not going to be as pertinent an issue as some people are making out. Now, the Bradleys, obviously I would not want to be driving a Bradley if it happens to come into the sights of a T-90M. Bradleys have quite large profiles. They're very big targets. They come into the sights of T-72s or T-90s. I can imagine they're probably not going to fare well. But as why, at the end of the day, is why did the Russians pull T-62s out of storage? Why did the Ukrainians pull T-55s out of Slovenia? If it's got a big gun and it can shoot, it's of some utility. Going back to how the Ukrainians conducted the Kharkiv offensive, the Ukrainians are very much adept at doing these very mobile offensives out of surprise. With BMPs, BTRs, if they've got a couple Bradleys that go along to it, it just upgrades and augments that Ukrainian capability. Like I say, it's only 50 Bradleys going so far, but I can imagine in the coming American aid packages in the months to come, that number will probably increase. So then it'll come to how the Russians counteract that, and we'll just have to wait and see how it happens. But again, because I can probably hear it in chat and in my Telegram, there was probably people who are going, oh, copium and more Western drunk that was Wunderwaffe and stuff. No one's ever claimed that. It's just it's more equipment to Ukraine that upgrades their capabilities. So that's the way you have to look at it. And it's also, I think this is another red line that Russia and Putin tried to put down and say the West shouldn't supply this to Ukraine. And they have, and the Russians just seem kind of unwilling or unable to act on those red lines. So, is there something else I was looking to add to that? So we'll have to keep an eye out and see what model of Bradley goes out and other NATO equipment that goes the stream died? Chat, could you just confirm me, has the stream died or... What's going on here? Did I just get a confirmation and it's good? Okay, thank you. I don't know, it just kind of lagged out for me a bit there. So, the other thing to consider is that, yes, it's good that Ukraine is getting all this, well, if you're pro-Ukrainian, it's all well and good that Ukraine is getting all this fancy Western equipment. It also comes with a downside. Logistics, parts. If you're a Ukrainian logistician, it's one thing if everything was built to Soviet standards, you can all use the same parts here and there. If you're now having to juggle between a French Fab, an American-made Bradley, to a BMP, to a Challenger 2, to a T-72, you're going to have a very large storage of parts. You're going to have to know where those parts are. If you're missing a part for a certain tank, if you're, say, for example, you're in a mechanized battalion that uses BTRs, and suddenly you're given Bradleys, well, you better hope that the Americans and the logistics know where you are with those Bradleys so that they can send you parts to keep your Bradleys operating. And also training is going to get a bit hectic. I know a lot of people seem to think, well, if you train on a tank, you can just transfer to a different tank. Soviet tanks are very different. The T-72s and T-64s, they're very different to Western tanks. And even amongst Western tanks, from my understanding, is Challengers, they're not drastically different, but they are different in operation in how to use them from Leopards. And then obviously Leopards and Challengers are very different to how you would operate a Bradley, I would imagine. So whereas you could have a person who trains, this is how the Ukrainians are able to use captured Russian T-72s and the T-90s. It's all the same pattern generally. If you train on a T-64, you'll have a very good idea how to operate a T-72 up to a T-90 to a T-80. While I'm sure there are very basic same principles between the operation of a tank, Western tanks are going to have a different layout, have different capabilities. The crews will have to understand what to expect of their tanks. So if you train on a T-64, you have an idea of what the T-64 can do and how far you can push it. Then that'll probably give you a grounding of how far you can do, how you can push, say, a T-72. But if you're trained on a T-72 and then you're suddenly told, get in this Leopard 2 and away you go without proper training and just what you can do with the vehicle, how far you can push it, you're probably going to run into issues. So the Ukrainian training and logistics system is going to be pretty chaotic, I would imagine, in the near future and going on out. Whereas in Russia, it's all the same equipment, it's all the same standard. You could have a pretty uniform training regime for any Russian tanker or any Russian tank. Whereas in Ukraine, if you've got people trying to operate T-72s, T-55s, potentially Leopard 2s, potentially Challenger 2s, it's going to be pretty hectic. And the ability to transfer crews between different equipment, I would imagine, is probably going to be a bit chaotic at best. So, that is the spiel on tanks. I delete that. Yes, I did. Was there something else I was looking to address? I really need to write notes down whenever I have thoughts that come into my head. No, I think that'll be it. So, what about you, chat? Does anyone in chat have any questions that aren't cringe? You've heard from me, chat. Let's hear from you. What has chat got to say? with that wet spiel as I try and remember things that I need to pick up on. We have not seen Russia's new equipment yet. It's coming. I hope that's a joke. I hope that's a facetious post. Brads don't have to face the prospect of T90s, KF. They still lost a lot. It will not end well if they can't even keep running a grade, yes, but same result. Okay. How does those new transfers fare on Ukrainian terrain? Weight track with Western tracks, from my understanding, tend to be thinner than Soviet, Russian, Ukrainian traditional tracks. So in autumn and winter, probably not the best. However, in the summer, whenever the ground is dried out, I would imagine they're probably fare as well as Soviet equipment. But saying that, even Soviet legacy equipment has fared quite badly in the Rasputsia in the mud season in Ukraine, both at the start of the war and in recent months. So probably as well, because Western equipment tends to be larger, substantially larger than Soviet legacy and Russian equipment. So for example, to give you an idea, if I can find the specific photo I'm looking for. Forgive me, chat, I'm just looking for something to demo it. So, not the best photo, but I think I don't know why it's doing that, but not the best photo, but I think it sort of illustrates the point. Tank in the front is a T-72, tank in the back is a Leopard 2 A4 model. As you can see, the T-72 is not as large by any measure as the Leopard 2. See if I can find the same for... Yeah, that's a good example there, so I can use that for the next thing I'm going to discuss. And then just for another example, there is an American Abrams next to an Iraqi T-72 model, probably a Lion of Babylon. As you can see, the Abrams is fairly bulkier and larger than the T-72. And then, thankfully, again, forgive me that these aren't the largest photos, but I'm just making do. That's a Bradley compared to a BMP. As you can see, the Bradley is significantly larger than the BMP. Western equipment tends to be larger than Soviet equipment because Western equipment tends to have a lot more in it. Soviet equipment, by the doctrine, Soviet legacy equipment by its doctrine, would try to go as small as possible to present as small a target. So that is... It depends how it's used. If it's used by a competent crew and people who know what they're doing, maybe they can overcome it. But the Western tanks in APCs like the Bradley will present a fairly large target depending how they're used for the Russians. And going by how the deleterious cost of both Russian and to a degree Ukrainian armor in Ukraine, as it is, considering how small a lot of it tends to be compared to Western equipment, probably doesn't bode well if you're going to put Leopards and Bradleys out into open fields and try and thunder run Russian positions. They're probably not going to fare well. So they'd have to be smart in how they use it. How many railroad crossing the border? Which border you're going to have to... there's a number of borders in Ukraine. How vulnerable is Russia to a counterattack in Soledar? It all depends. At the end of the day, it depends how much the Ukrainians would commit to such an attack, because the Russians, I would imagine, the Wagner group at the very least, would be flooding Soledar with new men and equipment trying to exploit the breakthrough. So the Ukrainians, if they're going to counterattack, they're going to have to counterattack expecting to face significant resistance. So it all depends how cocky potentially the Russians are, well, the Wagner is in its advance and in defense, well, potential defense of Soledar. Is Russia restoring, upgrading tanks and storage? Yes. From my understanding, various T-72 models are being pulled out of deep storage and are going through God, whatever, however you pronounce it, the Russian tank factory, and are being upgraded to latest new models. The T-72 BV, no, is it the T-72 BM, is it the, I should know this, I talk about this stuff day in and day out. Trying to keep track of all these tank variants is melting my brain. T-72, is it the BVM 2022? Or is it the BV? How do I not know this off the top of my head? B3. Is it going to be the B3M 2022? I think it would be. Needless to say, is that the Russians have rushed out a variant, an upgrade package for the T-72, specifically to deal with what they've experienced in Ukraine, and it's T-72 BV3, whatever it is, model 2022. From my understanding, that's the model that these deep storage T-72s they're trying to upgrade to the standard, the old storage models to. And I'm not too sure if they even have the facilities to upgrade T-80s. Well, no, they obviously do, because they've been doing it for years. But it seems to be that they're focusing on the T-72s and T-90 models as opposed to the T-80s. I've not really seen any T-80s go through or all bands of God. Again, I think that's because that factory specifically just deals with T-72s, but the T-80s kind of are a bit more scarce on the field, as it were. Military personnel needs to be thoroughly trained before using military-grade weaponry. You can't just give weapons to... Yeah, I mean, I guess you could put tankers through a speed run course of the Challenger and the Leopard and maybe get them out into the field in a few months, but you're probably going to waste the asset that way, and they're probably going to get it killed or wreck the vehicle because they push it too far and don't understand the capabilities and the limits of the vehicle. The reason why Challenger and Leopard crews spend like 2.5, 3 years training on their vehicle is because they become elite. They are trained to an elite level in Western militaries to operate these vehicles, because these tanks in of themselves are so expensive. Western tanks are leagues more expensive than most Russian tanks because of the legacy of Soviet doctrine. T-90M is kind of changing that a bit, but the T-72 by its nature was a mass production tank. Western tank doctrine was to go, generally the Americans are a bit of an exception, but European militaries were very sophisticated tanks with very elite crews. It's very much quality over quantity. So the training is so extensive so that they understand and know generally the ins and outs of the vehicle, how far they can push the vehicle, what the vehicle is capable of in certain circumstances. And it takes a long time to build up that knowledge of that. Whereas if you just take someone out, like the T-72 is not a very sophisticated tank. The most sophisticated thing in it is the autoloader. Soviet doctrine was to make things rugged. It was to be bashed about, to be used by conscripts. Conscripts are not really the most well-trained people. It was very much mass production, as many as you can get into the field. It's why you can generally train on a Russian tank, a Soviet legacy tank, a lot quicker, but you're not going to be as skilled generally as a Western tank crew. So if you put a bunch of Ukrainian tankers who have not particularly skilled and understand a Western tank to a large degree and send them out into the field, well, granted, I guess the Ukrainians aren't paying for that tank, but the capabilities of that tank, if they just drive it out and they don't understand how far, how fast, how much pressure you can put on the drivetrain, and they break the drivetrain, or they detract the tank, or they screw up the engine some way or another, well, that multi tens of millions of dollar tank is now out of action, potentially destroyed because the crew didn't know how to properly operate it, the proper tactics with which to use it, and they drove it into a field and got it destroyed by a Russian Hornet strike. So that's the dynamic you'd have to look up. Tanks aren't rifles. If you're properly trained on a rifle, you can be very accurate and use that rifle well. But at the same time, a lot of people in the field with rifles has a utility of its own, whereas a small squad, very well trained on their rifle, it can achieve different things with different methods. So, how are Ukrainian using NATO weapons like this? Historically, Ukraine used USSR weapons. NATO special forces are guiding planning. Yeah, thousands of Ukrainian troops have been deployed outside of Ukraine, to Germany, to France, to Britain, I think to Canada as well, to train up on various Western bits of equipment. So that's what would happen, I would expect, if Leopards and Challengers are actually going to start to turn up in Ukraine. I'm actually still quite surprised that they're even suggesting Challengers at all, to be honest. Leopards, I could sort of understand, but the idea that the British government was going to start sending Challengers to Ukraine really kind of hit me for a curveball. But isn't NATO a bit too lean in Europe as it is? It depends on what you're talking about, what bit of equipment. This idea that NATO is running out of ammunition and NATO's being bled dry, not really. In specific bits of equipment, yes, but there's a lot of munitions factories in Europe alone, let alone the United States, that will always be able to pump stuff to Ukraine. And these Leopards and the Challengers and the Bradleys that are talking about being sent to Ukraine, this is stuff that is in storage. It's mothballed. It's not being used. Well, with the caveat, the Polish Leopards, from my understanding, are part of the stuff that's... So the Poles sent their T-72s and potentially their Twardys to Ukraine with the expectation that they are going to get Abrams, K2 Korean tanks, and Leopards from Germany. But the Poles, from my understanding, have said that 10 of the Leopards that the Germans are going to send them is they're going to send to Ukraine. So that's so of it, the Leopards that the Poles have earmarked to send to Ukraine are not mothballed. They I would imagine they're going to be fairly new, pretty well maintained. Russia could cut all rail and road links to Ukraine, make them fly everything in. No. How would the Russians do that? I don't understand your logic of thinking on that one, I'm afraid. They had the mothball MiG-22s and cannibalized some to go over running. That's Ukraine Air Force. If Russia since understood what there. I mean, just going back to that, I mean, what the Russians conceivably could do is they could try and destroy every bridge crossing the Dnieper. And I'm kind of curious why they haven't done that. That would cause serious problems for Ukraine, and I think that's a very feasible thing the Russians could do. Where am I? Chat's going quite fast. I should really If you really want me to read your chat, I know this is a bit of a shill, but a super chat would definitely get my attention. I'm just trying to skim through this stuff and see what's worth answering. If civil war starts in Brazil, do you think Ukraine would be on the back burner, being America? No, I don't think Brazil would really matter that much. No offense to Brazilians, but I don't think civil war is going to break out in Brazil, and I don't know too much of Brazilian politics, to be honest. Since you're trying to Michael, what do you think about the French AMX-10 they are planning to send to Ukraine? Again, it depends how well the crews to use it are trained and how the Ukrainians use it at the end of the day. Like the Bradleys in potentially the Western tanks, fairly decent bit of kit, but it's 80s era, so it's not ultra modern, but it does have a very good utility and it's quite speedy, and that gun on it can pack a bit of a punch. So again, it just depends how the Ukrainians use it, although they are quite squishy from my understanding. Lancet could probably take it out, so it all depends. Like the Russian equipment, it just depends how it's used and how competent the crews using it are. Is Europe morally going in the right direction, and could European people stomach consequences of total? No, Westerners are weak. They could never. I don't think Westerners could really stomach total war. A lot of Russian submarines, boats, big warplanes. Do you think it's possible for Russia to take Kherson? Oof. Not in the near future. A lot would have to happen for the Russians to retake Kherson. I think the Russians, and I think they have, hence why the Russians are shelling Kherson. I think they've given up on the city for the foreseeable future. It's hard for me to see how the Russians will ever really get on the western bank of the Dnieper again. Say it 3 times. Ural Vagonzavod. Ural Vagonzavod. Ural Vagonzavod. I'll have to get Giza to give me pronunciation lessons. Which reminds me, if you're interested in that kind of thing, what is the day today? Today is Wednesday. Friday, I will be streaming with Giza, and we're going to be playing a bit of The Forest, and we'll probably be talking. I'll be asking her questions like, what's it like in Novosibirsk, and questions about Siberia. So if you're into that kind of stuff, keep the eye out on the channel for Friday. Oral Vagonzavod. It's not that hard. Yeah, it is, but whenever you're saying it off the cuff and trying to speak a lot like I do, I'm not the best public speaker, so my tongue tends to get tied. I mean, I still can't pronounce Soledar and Russian properly. It's crazy how much Russia is riding on the success of Soledar and Bakhmut. I mean, 6 months to take. I mean, it's symbolic at this stage. But that's not the, it is a very good result for the Russians in Soledar. And also, whenever you consider the losses in Bakhmut for tying down the Ukrainian troops, the people who are dying are, I mean, I don't want to sound too mean, but they're the scum. They're drawn from the prisons. They're not exactly going to be missed in Russia, I guess. They're disposable. If anything, kind of sending them to the slaughter in Bakhmut to tie down the Ukrainian army there is a win-win for Russia. You lose a bunch of rapists, thieves, and murderers. In return, you kind of occupy a significant part of the Ukrainian army. Can you put another I picked this picture specifically for a reason. I knew some people would like it. Thanks for the response. I'm happy I was able to do it. 17 Ukrainian battalions have been eliminated. No, they haven't. 17 battalion has 800 people in it. So do you really think like 13,000 Ukrainians have been killed in Soledar? I mean, like, really? Most of the defense was held by I think it was the 47th Mechanized Air Brigade or something like that, with a bunch of other units involved. So I mean, you're talking about maybe 2,000 Ukrainians, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. Like, there wasn't. See, where do people get this idea? I don't get how people here are happy for lost lives. Yeah, I know. I don't understand it as well, but my chat is full of psychopaths and genocidal people in general. Bakhmut is a fortress and all sorts of underground infrastructure. Ukraine is making a stand there because it's the best chance of successful defense in the Donbass. Yes and no. I think Bakhmut is mostly a fortress because the Russians just took so long to actually try and take it that the Ukrainians were able to turn it into one. Is it possible that NATO has been secretly training Ukrainian to operate? I mean, it's not secretly, they're pretty open about it. NATO has been training Ukrainian soldiers and various equipment for years. Like I was saying earlier, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are at this moment training. I think the British have a program where every 3 months they train up a battalion of Ukrainian troops in close quarters combat up in Yorkshire. So, I mean, it's not really a secret. They're pretty open and explicit about it. Bakhmut ended up turning into kill box because of Russian artillery for whatever reason. The HIMARS were not able to counter battery enough to save them. I think that's down to, again, there's so few HIMARS that they use them in pinpoint strikes where they'll hurt the most. So that's where you get the HIMARS will hit like a barracks full of Russian soldiers, or they'll fire it at ammo dumps as opposed to dedicated counter battery, because while the Russian dominance in artillery has been eroded, it is still pretty domineering. There are thousands of Russian batteries and stuff out there. Whereas HIMARS, you have to keep them mobile, you have to keep moving them about so they don't get spotted by Russian drones and hit themselves, but also you want to keep HIMARS mobile, so if a Ukrainian drone sees a Smersh MLRS battery, the HIMAR can hit that, which will do a lot more damage to the Russians than, say, if the HIMARS was used to take out a bunch of towed MSTA guns. You know, like the HIMARS do a lot of damage, but again, because there's so few of them, you have to be very picky about how you use them. The Russians were the same to a degree with their Smershes, but you don't really see the Smersh operating too much anymore. From my understanding, most of them are up in Belgorod, firing rockets every now and again at Kharkov. Really look at a way to keep on top of chat better. Some guy posting in Cyrillic. The AMX also uses another bespoke round. I wasn't aware of that. Well, that's gonna complicate logistics a bit more, I'd imagine. Bradley's another IFVs being sent along with tanks supposedly coming soon to another counter effect. I mean, they can't. Both sides are almost certainly preparing the counter offensive. That was going to happen with or without these. The Bradleys, depending how fast they get there, I don't think we'll probably see them in combat until maybe the summer. We're still months out because one, I would imagine a Bradley is very different in its operation to a BMP. So you're going to have to properly train up the crew. And then if you're hoping for the crew to use those vehicles effectively, you probably want to put them through a bit of intensive training so they know the limits and the capabilities of the vehicle, instead of just giving them a refresh, like a basic course, and then putting them in it and pointing them at the front and sending them off. You could get away with that in the M113s and the VABs, because they're just battle taxis. They're just boxes which you put troops in to drive troops around. The Bradleys have a bit more to them. They've got a fairly decent Bushmaster cannon to them, and if they've got the tow addition to them as well, well, they've got a pretty beefy punch to them. So you can sort of squander the M113s, and you're not really going to be that much down on them. Whereas the Bradleys, depending how much the Americans want to supply them, you can get a bit more utility in combat out of a Bradley than an M113. Ukraine stay 5%, and NATO missed all tanks, all MLRs over 50. Okay. Where are you from? I'm from Northern Ireland, unfortunately. Russia should attack up Dnipro and Kharkiv. Dnipro's, Dnipro's kind of sacking, and that'll be its own stream. I need to do it, but I think Zaporozhye is a far more doable target for the Russians, which would cause a lot of problems for the Ukrainians. Ukraine are running out of manpower. No, Ukraine isn't. What is your opinion on Colonel Douglas McGregor? I don't have any. I've never watched any of his stuff or really know anything about him, so I couldn't tell you, to be honest. Oh yeah, that reminds me. There's been a shake-up in the Russian command. Colonel Lapin, we all thought he was kind of sacked in disgrace after Kharkiv. I need to stop saying Kharkov. He's now back. He's been put in charge of all Russian ground forces, effectively the Russian army. And Gerasimov is being promoted. He's now in charge of all operations with Sorovikin, the guy who is in charge overall command of the operations in Ukraine. He's now his deputy, so there's been a bit of a change in the Russian command staff as well over the past couple of weeks. Maybe a push from Soledar going north to Belarus. It's a bit more of a push than that. See what the Soviets done in World War II. History is a bit of a habit of repeating itself, but yeah, but then what about the history of World War One? Like this argument, the Russians never really fight until they need the fight, kind of thing. Like, well, they didn't do too well in Afghanistan. They didn't do too well in World War One, and this idea, well, the Russians don't start a war well. Look at the War of Napoleon and World War Two. I mean, like, what are you saying here? That Russia needs to lose a quarter of its population before it decides to start winning in Ukraine? Like, it's yeah, history often rhymes, but just because the Russians, and even then that was the Soviet Union, not the Russians. Russia and the Soviet Union are two very different things. Russia has no white man's burden, that's why. Well, actually, I picked the picture because my mindset was, well, Russia says they're fighting against the awful racist neo-Nazis. So that was my motivation behind choosing that picture as the background for this stream. But I guess that's how you guys want to perceive it, I guess. Go ahead. Bradleys are way more complicated than a BMP. Yeah, I would expect so. Like I say, especially if they've got the tow missile addition to it as well. It's not quite the same as having I can't say that missile's name because it gets me in trouble on YouTube. There's a very old anti-tank missile that the Russians and Soviets put on BMPs, and it's named after a bundle of sticks. And it's not very sophisticated. It's not quite a tow missile. How do those Russian heavy flamethrower systems work, and why are they called that? They look just like MLRS. Yeah, I find that naming a bit strange as well. That's the TOS. I'll put up a picture for people who are not aware what I'm about to talk about. So I was just asking a question. Why do all the pictures so small? So give me a big one. So a person's just asking me about this. Why is it called a heavy flamethrower? I'm afraid I can't give you a definitive answer. I'm just going by what I think it is because I haven't really looked into it. But this is called the TOS. It's also called the Sun. There's a couple of models of them. If you're really interested in Ukraine, you've probably seen these going about. From my understanding, these are called heavy flamethrowers because generally they were designed to fire a thermal round, an incendiary round. The range on these are actually quite short. I think it's like 5 miles and stuff because they fire quite heavy shells, warheads. They also fire the thermobaric warheads, which were used at Avostal and other places. As you can see, this is literally a tank with a rocket pod on top of it. The idea was that these are to go up with the tank battalions, and then whenever the tank battalions come across like a heavily invested strong point of infantry or such, well, because this is heavily armored and it's moving with the tanks, not that it can drive straight up and into the view of it, but it's to stay close to the front. So whenever the leading units come up against a hard point, this can put down pretty heavy artillery. Like I say, generally it was designed for incendiary rounds. There's also thermobaric warheads that go with it. It's kind of like a short range artillery for the battalion tactical groups, were originally designed for Soviet shock armies. So that's the mentality from my understanding of the TOSs. Are you a unionist? I mean, I don't really go too far into that. Yeah, I am a unionist, but I don't particularly want to talk about Northern Ireland. Mike, how are you still so misinformed on this conflict? Well, because I don't listen to Gonzalo. That's why I'm not getting the based red pills from Gonzalo's Lira's take on the war. Show us how you won your. Why stream just the night I have had a lodge meeting? Because the Russians set the time frame. Ukraine haven't won a single battle this war. Twitter is okay. But Kharkov. I mean, reasonably you could say Kiev, northeastern Ukraine. They pushed back the Russians in parts along Zaporozhye. I mean, whether the Russians pulled out or were forced out, the result is the same. Kherson is part of under Ukrainian control. Like, what's the? I just don't understand this worldview. Like, especially in the light of Kharkov, where the Ukrainians quite handedly just overrun and decimated the Russians there. Like, just. Why does this chat keep oh, and yeah, bunker housing, thank you very much for the 20 Swedish kronas. The stream should go up on live so it can be watched later if you're interested in it. To something in Cyrillic. Ukraine is like the Isles of Britain, foreign powers, force brothers, and brothers. Okay. Michael missing the geopolitics. I mean, I'm not specifically talking about the geopolitics here. Like, well, what is there to miss? Like, what do you want from me on this? Like I've talked about the geopolitics before. We mostly do it on Felix's streams whenever we did do those streams. But I mean, my streams largely focus on the tactical and like the nitty gritty military stuff. Like, Michael, did you watch Putin's New Year's speech? I didn't see you comment on it. No, I haven't. I actually haven't watched it in retrospect. It just kind of missed me by. I just kind of zoned out over the holiday period. Has Michael reviewed the shooting from today? Again, you're gonna have to specify that a bit for me, please. Every Bradley is followed by 15 tour buses full of mechanics. Yeah, Gonzalo, they are understanding of stuff. Thank you, Joe Jacko, for £15. That's very generous. Thank you so much. Dinner on me. Any news from the north / Belarus? I'm kind of tempted to do another stream on Belarus. But since the last stream that I did in Christmas, there hasn't been too much. There just has been a continual buildup of Russian assets in Belarus. Some tanks, actually, speak of the devil, considering I was talking about them earlier on about being missing. A lot of T-80s have started to appear in Belarus. A lot is probably a bit too much, but T-80s have started to turn up in Belarus. Some BTRs. 82s. The Russians are slowly building up forces in Belarus, but I don't think it's going to. It's a long way off before I think the Russian forces in Belarus can pull off an offensive action into Ukraine, to put it that way. But they are building up slowly and steadily in Belarus. There is a foreboding air that the Russians definitely have something coming. I think the weather's kind of pushed it back, but I think it's coming sooner or later. Where it's going to come is kind of the big question, but I think Soledar to a degree is a bit of a sideshow, a bit of a distraction potentially, to get Ukraine focusing on and around Bakhmut, whereas the Russians, and again, just through my own personal bias, I think it's going to be in the Zaporozhye direction, but the Russians definitely have something in the works coming down the road. I guess it just kind of depends who's going to strike first, the Ukrainians or the Russians. Ever watched the Duran channel? No, I've never watched a full episode. I've only watched clips that were posted to my channel. Even pro-Russian, I've started mocking Gonzalo. Yeah, I mean, Why are you obsessed with Gonzalo? Because chat keeps talking about him, and he's funny, and he's a meme. I appreciate your views, Michael. However, you missed a simple truth. Ukraine fights for acres of territory, and Russia fights for dead bodies, and unlike Ukraine, it values humanity. Okay. I might disagree with that, but okay. They would be stupid to attack, build your defenses. Okay, is there any more chats from anyone, guys? Does anyone else want to quickly chime in with something that isn't cringe and smooth-brained? Why is that so far down there? Okay, if that's gonna be, I'll bring back the picture everyone loves. That's it. I'll keep it up for just a little bit longer, but if anyone else wants to quickly chime in, but again, I'm going to be streaming with Giza on Friday. Kind of a chill out gaming stream. We're going to be playing The Forest. Don't know the time yet. I'll update the Telegram whenever it comes to it. Next week I will be doing another stream. Kind of depends on what's going to happen in Soledar. I expect it will have a bit more clarity on the situation there. It could develop a bit more, so maybe an update on what's happening around Bakhmut and events around then. If not, if things go a bit more quiet, I might do my sort of like conjecture Zaporozhye stream as well. Don't know what day next week because I have a lot of real life stuff I need to earn money IRL, unfortunately. So I'll have to play it by ear. Stream with pigeons soon. I'm always down for a stream. Felix is just seemingly dematerialized over Christmas. I never hear from him. He went back to the Far East and dropped off the face of the earth. So I'm always down to stream, but I guess he just needs to kind of reemerge. I just wanted to watch Michael's stream. Again, the stream will stay up. You can just go back and watch it. Who is Giza? Giza, Russian gamer girl who helps with translations every now and again. Can you quickly repeat your Bakhmut point? I mean, you can't really quickly. Yeah, it took me like 20 minutes to half an hour to expand upon it. We're not at the point where Bakhmut's going to fall, but recent developments to the south and the north of Bakhmut certainly have made the Ukrainian defense of the city complicated, to put it mildly. The city isn't imminently going to fall, but the road, so to speak, has potentially been opened where the Russians could start to seriously invest the city. That's probably as quickly as I can and succinctly I can put it. How do you earn money IRL? I'm not going to dox that. Thank you very much. This war looks like it's going nowhere fast. Will it end up like Korea? Again, I'm waiting to see how the coming offensives work out. That's depending how those go out. There is a scenario that could come about that I can conceivably think of where the conflict devolves into a larger Donbass style stalemate where the front lines just kind of get solidified. A provisional ceasefire-ish of sorts comes in, and it's kind of small scale, every now and again, small skirmishes and artillery duels are what mark it. So essentially what the war in the Donbass between 2015 and 2022 was largely like. That's kind of how I can see that's one scenario, and I think that is a plausible scenario of how I think the war could go. But I think it's all going to be about the big offensives that we've been expecting for the past couple of months. That's where I'm waiting to see how things will go. She's playing Vampire Masquerade right now. Okay. Giza's the best. When will you game with me? Thank you for the 20 Swedish crowns. I mean, what? Post in the chat. Some people have said I should set up a Discord, but I have this opinion that Discords often devolve into sussy, gay, degenerate stuff. So I'm kind of reluctant to set up a Discord, and I don't want to set up a Discord whenever I can just do a Telegram. I might see about setting up some kind of like gaming thing for people in the channel who are interested in that kind of stuff. I just don't know what would play, to be honest. So yeah. With that, is there any final questions? Anything people want to say just before I zone it out? No. So, with that, thanks for coming along. I hope it's been educational. I know some people are upset, as there's always people upset. But like I say, keep an eye out. There should be a couple more streams coming up, some on topic, some others not on topic. And I haven't chilled in a couple months. Money's a bit tight. So if you like what I do and you feel it's of worth, I would kindly ask if you might consider throwing a couple of coins my way. You're not obligated to, but it's all greatly appreciated. Onto the PayPal or the coffee links below, or maybe even Bitcoin. Whether it's a monthly donation setup or if it's a single thing, it's all greatly appreciated and it all helps keeps this a bit more sustainable. And thank you very much for anyone who has and thinks of doing that. Hopefully a peace deal can be made with the ethnic Russian East, become part of Russia and Ukraine, big country accepts us before it's too late. A military summary in Weeb Union is a very good. Okay. What's Giza's channel name? I think it is just Giza. If you want money, maybe you should stream more up. Yeah, I'm often quite busy, but yeah, I do need to stream more. But with that, thanks very much, guys. I hope you all got something out of it, and I'll see you again soon. Have a good one and have a good evening, everyone. Keep safe.